welcome back. Well, his views have been eagerly promoted to support tax policy moves by all three parties, but there's only one Jack Mintz, and he calls it the way he sees it without partisan considerations. The President's Fellow at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy joins me live to size up the promises so far. Nice to have you in the studio live here, Jack.
My pleasure.
You caused a bit of a stir last week. You cautioned in some ways that taxes to small business may not be the way to go. Why not?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to remember that when you cut the small business rate, there are two things that can happen. Number one, those people who are growing businesses can make a choice between whether they run it as their business that would be subject to normal personal income tax rules, or they can create a corporation. And if they create a corporation, they can lower their taxes, which you might say, oh, that'll help create more investment. On the other hand, we know that from past studies is that many small businesses, once they get created, they don't actually grow very much. And that's because they face this wall of taxation. And that's because we've had the wrong incentives in place. Having just small rates is not a good idea, because as soon as you get larger and you get the profits, you lose the advantage. And the United Kingdom, for example, has eliminated the difference between large and small rates. And they've also brought in a different type of incentive so that if the company grows, it doesn't lose it. And that's been through some expensing of capital for tax purposes. You've
watched the parties roll out bits and pieces of their economic platforms. Do you see a magic solution here for a fairly stagnant economy, bits and pieces that you like or don't like, and what's the perfect solution?
Well, I actually feel we don't really have any party with a comprehensive growth-oriented plan. And if you sort of sit down and you look at the Canadian economy today, we're going through a major structural change. We've had 15 years of better growth. Part of that has been the resource economy was doing really well. We had this super cycle of commodity prices worldwide. It's been a benefit to Canada. That's over, and now we have to do something different. And having a low dollar isn't just the answer. We have to improve our labor productivity, and there's a whole bunch of reforms that we need to consider. And I sort of think of the Australian experience back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. They undertook a slew of reforms, labor reforms, trade reforms, tax reforms, a whole bunch of things to do things. And to me, raising corporate tax is just the wrong thing to do. We're going to be actually penalizing our knowledge-based economy, our transportation industries, our communication industries, actually utilities. They actually build infrastructure. And in fact, public infrastructure is not the only answer. In fact, private infrastructure is also important. We have a regulatory system that's too slow. We have a tax system that is kind of anti-infrastructure when it comes to the private sector. So there's a whole bunch of reforms we should be thinking about.
But is going into deficit, i.e. Justin Trudeau's plan to sort of stimulate some sort of, I guess it's an industrial infrastructure, public infrastructure, does that make sense to you?
Well, actually, my concern over the deficit isn't so much whether we have $1 billion deficit or not. It's life can go on with that. My biggest concern is what's going to be the fiscal anchor after that. I was around the table with Paul Martin when he was Minister of Finance, and he did a great job in dealing with the deficit, getting us to run surpluses, and then we had 12 succeeding years of surpluses in Canada under the Liberal and the Conservative governments, and that was really exceptional. The question is that if you say we're going to have a deficit, how far do you go down the road? The demands for public spending are infinite by individuals because they think they don't have to pay for it. And so then in the end, you can end up with huge deficits, much bigger than that we're planning, because no one's saying, okay, what's the maximum that we can tolerate? And so I think, once you move away from that, budget surplus or balanced budget type of goal, then you lose that fiscal discipline, and that's my biggest concern.
What can you do? I mean, I wear my love of Alberta on my sleeve a little bit because I was there for so many years, but what can Alberta doesn't ask for help, but do they need it? Does the oil industry need some sort of government helping hand, or are they just going to have to go through this cycle and come back eventually?
Well, it's very interesting that you see in Ontario when a sector gets in trouble, like manufacturing, they're at the government asking for handouts.
Right.
In Alberta, you don't get that same desire by the business community. I think partly because they go through cycles all the time, they're used to it. But I think Alberta is going to be going through a major transformation, and they're getting strongly hit for sure.
All right, Jack Mintz, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. I'm glad you're in the studio.
My pleasure.
Love to hear you back again. Okay, thank you, sir.